Hello, welcome to the lecture. I'm Cynthia McAllister. In this lecture, you will learn about the work time format, including its primary aim and procedures. This lecture will also include a full description of the work time format. The primary aim of work time is to provide students the opportunity to practice autonomy and independence in pursuit of learning goals and to develop dispositions of self-determined learners. In addition, work time supports socially active, collaborative learning so that students can practice interdependence and cooperation. The summary procedures are these. Students take responsibility to adhere to procedures for a range of self-selected activities that align with curriculum objectives. For example, familiar rereading, math skill building, reading skill activities, reading and research activities related to content subjects. Students adhere to activity procedures that have been specified in whole class presentations or activity instructions. It's important that teachers present a large range of possible activities and indicate which of these are mandated or required. Students should be provided flexibility and have as much autonomy as possible in making decisions about when they will attend to the teacher-directed activity in order to develop their planning skills. About half of what students do during work time should be tasks that they conceive of that relate to formal learning standards or curriculum objectives. This is necessary so that students develop skills of resourcefulness and critical inquiry. The emphasis of work time is to provide students with opportunities to pursue their own work agendas that consist of activities which allow the exercise of free will and autonomy, and those that bring about desired learning outcomes. Since students pursue activities of choice and not necessarily always those assigned by someone else, they're motivated to approach work time with the same intensity they approach play or games. This is true because we know that choice and autonomy are important factors in motivation and self-determination. During work time, students enjoy maximum choice to read, write, do activities of choice, freely use space and materials, and to freely collaborate with peers. So why is autonomy so important to learning? There are a couple of key insights I want to share that might help answer this question. The first is from science. Specifically, insights from neuroscience provide a possible answer. Thoughts relating to our actions are actually triggered in the brain about a split second before we're aware of the conscious decision to act. This is called the readiness potential, and it's an electrical impulse sparked in the brain just a third of a second before voluntary movement. It's a trigger pulled from our subconscious mental states that initiates actions that are either then approved or rejected by us consciously. Breach. If you're like me, this fact shook me up when I first learned about it. Our subconscious mind sets a course of action even before we are consciously aware of that action? How could that even be possible? It seemed counterintuitive to me. It seems I'm always consciously thinking about the actions I take, right? How is it possible to take an action and not be aware of it? But I read a book called Principles of Neuroscience, which helped me understand the processes involved and convinced me this is true. And this became a concept that helped part the sky for me and shed a little more light on how we as teachers need to help our students have more agency as learners. This insight helped me understand the possible mechanisms of dispositions that kids have and helped me think about the conditions of the classroom culture that might have an influence in shaping these dispositions for the better. So, back to the readiness potential. Our brain triggers a course of action before we're aware of it. In other words, our subconscious disposition toward a particular action has a lot to do with whether or not we will decide to pursue the action. So I'll give you an example. Writing a book report. This task involves hundreds of constituent actions. The more obvious ones, like taking steps to spell words correctly or writing transition sentences between paragraphs or providing details to support claims, are usually the focus of direct instruction and instructional activities. But writing of any kind is challenging, and to do something that is challenging with any level of distinction or merit requires a little bit of obsession or subconscious preoccupation, or at least the absence of fear and anxiety. Knowing in the back of your mind that you have to write a book report and having that knowledge be associated with feelings of motivation and positive anticipation allows you to channel your subconscious thoughts to provide momentum for the task. Even when you aren't aware of it, your mind is dwelling on the writing task. The pieces begin to fall into place. You do things like raise the topic that you're writing about in talking to a friend. The few points your friend has to say about the book and the way you talk about it settle into your memory, and because your brain is thinking about the book, even when it's not a focus of your conscious thought, those points find expression in the composition process when you finally sit down to write. Because of the tremendous power that subconscious states have on learning, schooling practices should be organized to harness subconscious thought to enhance learning, but unfortunately, they don't. So why haven't schooling practices changed? If so much is known about the important relationship that subconscious thoughts have to learning, why aren't schooling practices organized in ways that take these concerns into account? Well, mostly this has to do with tradition. Because subconscious states were dismissed by the field of experimental psychology as being off limits for consideration during most of the 20th century, these were not the focus of educational research. Sigmund Freud was the first to suggest that a person's actions are partly driven by unconscious mental states, naming this phenomenon psychic determinism. This view was rejected by the field of experimental psychology for most of the 20th century, and unconscious or unobservable realms of thought were left to the purview of the field of psychotherapy. Scientists in the field of educational psychology, influenced mostly by behaviorism, discounted unobservable behaviors as being worthy of study. Only observable actions were considered a legitimate research focus. And not until the cognitive revolution, when the research community began to focus attention on mental states and the meanings that people make of their encounters with the world, was behavior unseated as the dominant paradigm in educational psychology. And all this didn't begin to happen until the late 60s and early 70s. By this time, instructional practices were heavily influenced by behaviorism and became really very well rooted in the traditions of schooling and curriculum. Even though the readiness potential was discovered 50 years ago, this finding has had little impact on schooling practices. Even though we know that our actions are partly determined by psychological states that lie beneath our conscious awareness, instructional approaches aimed at specific targeted cognitive outcomes are prescribed as means for students to reach those outcomes. Activities with the objective of influencing underlying dispositions are rarely the focus of instruction. I'll give you an example. Curriculum tasks typically consist of a set of prescribed activities based on evidence of what has been successful in experimental situations to be associated with targeted outcomes, regardless of students' dispositions towards such activities. For example, phonics knowledge has proven to be an important sub-process of reading, and activities that develop memory for phonics knowledge have been associated with greater phonics knowledge in research experiments. So, curriculum activities that focus on phonics drills are prescribed. These practices work, especially for most students whose dispositions are favorable to the activities and the activity context. But invariably there are students who don't respond favorably to the activity or context due to a variety of reasons that have to do with things like dispositions, attitude, lagging social or cognitive skills, among other factors. If the readiness potential triggers an action before awareness, the avoidance and resistance we see beginning to develop in early elementary school years in some kids to the one-size-fits-all treatments that we see in school make sense. These students appear abnormal in the phonics knowledge domain, and the logic of the intervention points out a need for more intensive instruction. The curriculum in most schools is based largely on this prescribed teacher-directed activity sequence developed under the dictates of this logic. But it's time to add the variables of motivation and attitude to the equation of what works in research and development of curriculum and instructional activities. If our goal is for all students to learn, it isn't ethical to impose upon all students the instructional practices that have only proven to be accessible for some, even if the number is statistically significant. So what if we abandon that traditional logic for a moment? What if, rather than prescribing an activity that might target a lagging skill, but also triggers resistance, we try instead to create activities that will have an impact on underlying dispositions? What would that kind of instructional intervention look like? My answer to this question was work time, combined with the share, which you'll learn about in a subsequent lecture. Back to our phonics example. If phonics skills can be camouflaged inside letter and word games and activities and free time for writing, memory having to do with the association between letters and sounds will develop as a product of students taking initiative to play and having fun. The disposition or inclination to play, already existing in most kids, will spark an action that will bring the student to a situation in which he or she is made to selectively attend to letter-sound relationships. Essentially, we trick kids into learning the stuff of our teaching agendas by letting them have their way in play. In medical terms, we make the medicine taste like bubblegum so that students eagerly accept the daily dose of treatment. Of course, I'm being tongue-in-cheek. We don't trick children. We create learning situations in which they engage in activities that help them and allow them to learn the things that they need to learn. Students will be more fully invested in the things we ask them to do in school when the parameters for the activities are broad enough to allow autonomy and choice, so that their values and interests find expression in schoolwork. Since much of what we do is governed by feelings and thoughts that lie beneath our conscious perception, the more autonomy the curriculum provides, the greater the connectedness between the live students lead beyond the classroom walls and the things they do in the classroom will come together. The second key insight comes from progressive education traditions. Work time has been a valued feature of progressive education since the 19th century at least. The work of Sylvia Ashton Warner, John Dewey, Francis Parker, and Maria Montessori are some of the examples. It's also been a central feature of some contemporary literacy approaches such as reading workshop and writing workshop. Progressives have always recognized that children are more engaged and motivated when they have freedom and autonomy to engage in activities of choice. After all, the readiness potential has always existed in human beings. Maria Montessori wrote, and I quote, "We permit the child to select the position which he finds most comfortable. He can make himself comfortable as well as seat himself in his own place. And this freedom is not only an external sign of liberty, but a means of education." End quote. If a child knocks a chair to the floor, Montessori explained, it's proof of an incapacity and provides means by which the child can correct himself, resulting in proof of the power gained over his learning. So freedoms instill agency. As Montessori indicates, with freedom of action comes responsibility for action. Traditionally, it was the teacher's role to maintain a silent order in the classroom during work time. But the learning culture's approach is based on the understanding that children need enough freedom so they can experiment, make mistakes, and learn rules and boundaries through experience. The social world is an engine for learning. Having choices about whom to work with is as important as having choices about what activities to do. If intellectual development depends on shared subjectivity, having choice about collaborative work partners is a way of exercising freedom of thought. When children are permitted to sit where they want and with whom they wish during work time, choose materials of their choice and talk freely, they will abuse these freedoms. But silly, noisy, and rambunctious transgressions present opportunities for teachers to intervene and teach children how to assume responsibility for their actions. Misbehaviors are viewed as opportunities for new learning. When freedom is new and children are just learning to take personal responsibility for their actions during work time, teachers need to plan to spend time intervening when necessary and teaching expected behaviors. Once desired behaviors are established and secured in social practices, the practices themselves function to maintain the established behavioral norms. The students themselves will take responsibility to regulate one another in social learning groups, and teachers will begin to hear students make comments like, "I think we're being a little too silly now," or "Henry, you're not paying attention." In addition to allowing the children the chance to develop academic competencies, work time gives them a chance to exercise and develop their academic identities as they practice social relationships as a means to use and explore texts. For example, reading, writing, or word games enjoyed in the company of friends allows the child to make moves that demonstrate competencies to others, reinforcing a positive academic identity. Now I want to present a metaphor for teaching. It's called the activity arc. This image was inspired in my thinking by what we know about human intentionality and how our actions come into being. Traditionally, teachers ask students to complete activities that are specified in lesson plans. Then judgments are made about student independence relative to how well they follow instructions and finish their assignments. Students who are successful typically get characterized as those who complete assignments independently. Those who don't are characterized as kids who lack independence. But do teacher-directed tasks really teach students how to be independent? Or is it more the case that they give students opportunities to practice following directions of others? Do they teach independence or obedience? Learning cultures fosters independence by allowing students freedom to make goals for their learning and follow the actions that they need in order to achieve those goals. Those accustomed to being told what to do might initially have difficulty coping with freedom. We often find this is the case in students who reach middle school or high school who have been used to highly teacher-directed traditional classrooms. And teachers accustomed to a curriculum of telling and assigning might find it nearly impossible to fathom concrete strategies that help students learn to be independent while holding them accountable to high learning standards without resorting back to teacher-developed activities. But it's possible. The activity arc is a tool to help teachers support independence in students. It can be used with students of all ages in all content areas. So what is an activity arc? An activity arc is a symbol that's shaped like a rainbow, or the gateway arch. It symbolizes the journey a person takes through the process of beginning and completing any activity. It represents a fully completed, goal-directed activity. The activity can be short and simple, like writing a sentence, or baking a cake, or complex and long-term, like finishing a term-length research paper. Some activity arcs are comprised of multiple arcs. Some activity arcs are premeditated, like doing chores before going out with friends. In the drawing of the arc presented here, the beginning of the activity is rendered in blue, representing the state of existence before beginning an activity. It's essentially who you are before your readiness potential is triggered. The color red represents a growing sense of awareness, motivation, and commitment. Yellow symbolizes the inevitable self-doubt that tends to accompany extremely challenging activities. And green suggests the nearing completion of activity and the generative influence the sense of accomplishment has on one's sense of self. The right base of the arc flattens to a lighter shade of blue than the left, symbolizing a changed state of existence after having completed the activity. The activity arc is somewhat deceptive. It suggests a continuous process, from inception of an intention to a completion of an act. But in reality, the process is segmented. John Searle, the philosopher, asserts that there are three gaps in intentional actions. The gap between reasons and the decision, which is the formation of a prior intention. The gap between the decision and the onset of action, the intention in action. And, for complex actions, the gap between the onset of the action and the continuation to its completion. The name for the gap, Searle points out, is freedom of will. Effective teachers are able to help their students close these gaps. Closing the gaps, or traversing the arc and reaching the foot of completion in the end, depends entirely on will. If only raising achievement outcomes were as simple as raising educational standards or designing better units of study or better curriculum bundles or raising standards for teacher quality, that would be nice. But closing these gaps and allowing students to execute activity arcs that guide them to meet high learning standards is no less challenging then to help those students close their own gaps through their free will and to successfully learn to carry out their intentions. The work time format provides ample opportunity for every student to pursue their own activity arcs. In this image here, the work time is rendered in the center, anchored on either side by lessons in the beginning of the activity block and the share at the end. As you can see, work time is a container for every student to exercise their will in completing activities. Teachers can use the ARC as a teaching tool in routines and social process lessons and individual conferences with students, and students can use them as a tool for planning independent work. The ARC makes the course from the point of having an intention to completing an activity a concrete object that can be reflected on and applied in multiple curriculum areas. There's a characteristic to a successful work time. There's a certain hum. Work time, learning culture style, requires social interaction, and things can get noisy. Teachers at every grade level will continually have to teach children to monitor and modulate their voices. Voice levels should be the focus of the first day of the year lesson and should be revisited as needed. Some teachers post a voice scale in their classrooms. For example, 0 for silent, 1 for whispering, 2 for quiet talking, 3 for loud talking, and 4 for playground voices. They make reference to this scale when necessary. If the noise level is too high, scan the room, identify the trouble spots, and go directly to the students who seem to be making more than their fair share of noise. Bring your conference forms and use this conversation as a learning opportunity. Say, your voices are at a 4. What do you need to do? Teach students how to manage the environment independently. Develop a system of signals. For example, if you're working with a group and the noise level gets too high and you can't leave the table, ask another student to deliver a reminder that you have previously introduced, such as a yellow card that signals a foul, that a child has broken a rule. Teachers themselves should abide by the rules established. Teachers who violate their own rules undermine them after all. When students have been taught not to yell or talk in loud voices, teachers undermine their own efforts when they shout or yell to interrupt the class because their voices are too high. Work time is a protected space, and teachers set an example when they themselves abide by the rules they've established. Work time is also a context for individualized and group instruction. A robust work time, one in which all students are independently and industriously engaged for a sustained period of time, provides a context for teachers to provide powerful instruction and to conduct curriculum-embedded assessment. Why? First, since students are highly engaged in academic activities, interruptions are minimal. Once students know expectations, the teacher can conduct group and one-on-one meetings efficiently. Second, since students are already focused and engaged in intellectual work, teachers can initiate instructional dialogue with students immediately without the need to provide an anticipatory set or lead-in or bridge-in activities. That part of the lesson that teachers plan in order to capture students' attention and interests. Eliminating the need for lead-in eliminates the planning time it requires, which is substantial when a teacher needs to plan as many as 7 lessons each day. It also frees more lesson time to teach into the focus topic. So let's summarize and review. In this lecture, you learned about work time, the heart of the learning cultures model. You learned about its primary aim, to support the development of agency and independence. You learned about key ideas that create a foundation for work time from science and progressive education traditions. You learned about the activity arc as a metaphor for teaching independence and accomplishment. And you learned about some of the principles that warrant an emphasis on work time. So here's a challenge. Can you recall what these principles were? Without referring back to the lecture recording or the transcript, try to explain the reasons that work time is consequential to students' development and learning, and discuss your reasons with a colleague before you refer back to the lecture.